Welcome back to the Season 1 finale of Make This Movie. We're here. Please stay tuned after the show for some new announcements and some thank yous. So thank you. Have you ever stumbled upon a snapshot of yourself you didn't know existed? Maybe you're on social media or with a friend who shows you a candid image of you doing something you have no recollection of doing, and you weren't drinking. Maybe you don't recognize yourself at first, or even recall the context of the shot. You've been so conditioned to experience your life through your eyes and brain, or pictures you already know well, that when confronted with a new view of your existence, you're momentarily baffled. But then, as you familiarize yourself to it, it becomes a part of that greater context. You see it as another entry in the timeline, another piece of documentation. Maybe you even begin to remember that time or place with greater clarity, and the picture of you might not have recognized becomes the you've always known. When the storm started to break and the horizon was growing clearer, I started work on this series. At some point, I went through some audio recordings looking for something unrelated and found my audio diary from the morning after our night shoot, day 3 of production on Counterintelligence. I'd completely forgotten it existed, probably because I was exhausted and delirious at the time of its recording. You've heard it here throughout the season, predominantly during the production section.
I feel happy that we got the essentials, and the essentials we got are really strong.
Listening to the entire recording, I not only relived that night's shoot, I relived the entire process, everything leading up to it, and everything since.
It was long. It was very long.
The recording is tumultuous, to say the least. It is the storm. My uncertainty following the night shoot translates through, as I began with nervousness.
I also feel like, for the most part, people maintain their focus.
Then moved into frustration.
I hope that he was satisfied with the experience. Really, is the main thing.
Then into some joyous recollections.
That was a happy surprise. That was a happy accident.
Buoyed by more uncertainty.
That happened. But all in all, I think we got good stuff with him. I was so sort of like zoned out at that point that admittedly I don't know if it completely landed, but I think it did. I think we did okay.
But as I listened along, inching toward the end of the nearly 30-minute recording, I felt the tension lift and lift. I knew now that my uncertainties had been squelched. Everything had worked out for the better. I knew we'd made it all the way through, and that more difficult moments were yet to come after this recording. I remembered it all, and I had already done a series of interviews with the cast and crew that would serve to fill out Make This Movie Season 1. And looking back, still sitting on a massive expense, some debt, and uncertainty how the world would receive this labor of love, I remembered why I'd done it in the first place. I'm a process person. When your career sort of plugs along as mine has, you kind of have to be. Because if you're only in the game for outcomes, without the process and the growth, you could one day just decide, well, it hasn't worked out yet. Time for something new. But if you love the process, relish in it, eat it up, and take its education forward, well, you'll never stop. Welcome to the season finale of Make This Movie.
A free film. For no money, for no anything. Half of the battle to make a good film in the United States. A free film, I say good film, it's a free film. Whether it's good or bad, we don't know. But we'll put a year in for no money, for no anything. Simply because there's an expression that has to be said. Now, we don't have any reverence for this expression. We don't believe it's a church. We have to have a good time, otherwise we die. I mean, how much does this cost? You know, paper to do the hard work, and how much does reels cost? We get it all from the major studios. They help us destroy them. That's the way we work. Because if we make a good film, they will only suffer. And as they suffer, they come and they say, please make films for us. And we say, no, we don't want to make films for you. Hip hip hooray.
All films just begin as ideas, intangible, fleeting thoughts that captivate those who have them. Some strike like lightning, others dull rumbles that hover below the surface and slowly trickle onto the page. Then, by some crazy confluence of chance and labor, collaboration, single-mindedness, bold passion, and follow-through, a work emerges. Counterintelligence struck like lightning. Then, by near chance, it began coming together. By labor and other variables, it emerged. And by even greater chance, it remains relevant in ways I'd cancel out if I could. It's a story about corruption, idiocy, power, and property. It's a story about the top of society and the bottom and how neither hand sees what the other's doing. And it's occasionally very, very funny. And just like Counterintelligence itself, this series is a story. Were it not for the fact that the film blossomed into a piece of work, there would be no season 1 of Make This Movie. The podcast has rolled around in my mind for the better part of 4 years, even before it had a subject. The notion of serializing the filmmaking process in audio form seemed a compelling way to explore its narrative and, most importantly, lessons. Stories need endings. I've always said there are 2 types of people in the world: Spielberg people and Scorsese people. Spielberg people like their endings clean, clear resolves, and the obvious point wherein the film fades out one last time. The characters have learned their lessons, and so too has the audience. Now, Scorsese people see the world as ongoing, and their stories never end as much as they simply stop. Those stories often start somewhere in the middle of a larger tale and end at a point where the audience knows there's more to come from any of these characters, and it's up to them to come to any moral conclusion. When I first previewed Counterintelligence for my Showhawk co-founder, Mike Hall, he cited the film's end and threw my oft-spoken words right back at me. You need to decide whether you want a Scorsese ending or a Spielberg ending. I've always been the Scorsese type. His films reflect my worldview to a great extent. But Make This Movie is different. You've made it this far with me, and I thank you for that. While Counterintelligence has yet to come out, the making process is just about over, and there are some lessons I've learned. Too many to cover, though most are nested throughout this season. All of them I'll take to the next film and iterate upon, because, like Altman said, looking back on his filmography, it's all just one film to me, just different chapters. When we began pre-production, we knew we were small, that this film was an experiment, and that there was an element of can we do this at play?
So I'm very lazy as a person, and raising money is also something that I'm not, like that takes me out of my comfort zone. And so I don't want to have to try to get social media gathered around my cause to make a film, because then all of a sudden I feel like I'm having to serve my thoughts and my perspective on the filmmaking to not just my own self, but, you know, to the people who were kind enough to support. So, you know, we didn't raise money. We didn't raise very much money to do this. But in the end, like, I felt it was a lot more punk rock to do it that way.
Part of what sustains my creativity is challenge. Each project I've taken on, big and small, presents some new obstacle to overcome or skill to learn. On Counterintelligence, the biggest challenge I put in front of myself was collaboration. It was to divorce myself of the one-man army mentality and embrace the skills and creativity of those around me. I didn't always succeed, particularly toward the end as resources ran thinner. As you mostly heard, Andréa Tolbert was good to remind me of this.
Like the last movie, you had to do everything yourself, and everything was like, I have to do it myself. And, you know, talking to you, like, you don't have to do everything yourself. You can let other people in, and you can share a vision. And it's your vision, and you can share it, and people will be behind that. And I think that you did a really good job this time, pre and while we're working on the film, of letting people in and sharing your vision and just being a little bit more open.
This particular lesson leaves its fingerprint on all the rest. If I were to audit myself based on producing Counterintelligence, I'd say I made major forward strides in this department, but still left more on the table. More to pick up on the next film. And that's process. So when you hear the list of 12 lessons I'm about to conclude this inaugural season with, know that each of them could have been shortcut with even greater collaboration. Then there's passion, the other underwriting theme. Not a lesson, an essential constant. It's crucial. Some filmmakers jump in with commercial aspirations only. They think of the money to be made from a specific project, and this is fine. It's an approach. It certainly informed some decisions for me. Though I have hopes for counterintelligence in the marketplace and some data to back those hopes up, there was a greater sense of curiosity that made it worth endeavoring through. The same philosophy David Pennington, my producer on my previous film, Light, reminded me of in our crowdfunding conversation back in 2013.
What really struck me about Chris is that he didn't have his eye on the pie in the sky about this film. He was not like, this is going to go to the Oscars and win up, best documentary or anything like that. Not to say that he's not an ambitious man, but he has a very, I think, very measured and very deliberate and very realistic objectives, I think. Because there were the very personal ones, is that you personally needed to work this out and experience this, to be on the ground there, to shoot this film, and to learn from that process. So that objective, is, we can check that off the list. The next one, to cut a film within a given amount of time and to present this to, it's film, so it takes a little bit longer. Yeah. So that was done, and now we've got the premiere coming up next month. Right. And then even your after the premiere, your marketing goals in terms of, educational institutions, Lebanese communities.
Even though it didn't fully come to pass on Light, I think I learned why in that process and brought that lesson here. I still feel this way, that you should follow your passion and figure out where that fits in the market. It's also a luxury of working on a small budget. The more money is at stake, the harder it is to take bigger risks. Making this season has reinforced to me that brevity matters. There's no sense saying in 3 words what can be said in 2. Now, I can't say it always panned out here, but there was a lot to say, and Make This Movie was a process like any other. At this point, while it hurts that after these 12 lessons and the end of my audio diary, this season will be over, I know I shouldn't delay any further. So, here they are. The 12 lessons, 1 for each episode. Lesson 1. Write without limits and edit in borders. After my first feature, The Painted City, I went through a writer's block that lasted for years. I'd toil away at multiple scripts, some running too long, others never getting past a couple pages. Counterintelligence was the second of 3 feature scripts I wrote in the same year as I brought serious writing back into my life. How did I bounce back? Simply put, I gave myself permission to write like shit, and with that, permission to let my imagination run wild. I promised myself complete freedom to follow rabbit holes and deviate from the plan. Sometimes I'd get flustered, like there's no way this'll work, but I told myself never to stop or start over. Just keep pressing through. You'll be there to clean it up when it's done. Sometimes new characters would pop up or characters would completely change as I got further downstream. This was okay. Inconsistencies could be ironed out later on in editing. If characters made inconsistent actions, I could assess them through the edits. If the inconsistent action was more interesting than the alternatives, I could justify them in later drafts by adding or subtracting details. Too many writers get so hung up on the details in their first draft that they never actually finish it. For me, removing mental barriers and going where my imagination took me helped at the very least get a completed script claimed to the page. It didn't have to be good. It just needed to be done. Good came later. Writing a first draft and editing later drafts are 2 distinct tasks involving 2 separate mental processes, so operating them independent of one another was freeing and allowed for the most important factor of feature screenwriting: finishing. Lesson 2. The best possible film has a price. All 3 feature scripts I wrote in that year had a base price, a cost required to make the best version of that film possible. You've probably seen plenty of films that were in over their head. Maybe the visual effects were half-baked or elements were missing that could have made it better. There are plenty of horror stories, filmmakers fund to film at half the price they need to get the finished movie, and it suffers. When deciding to move ahead with Counterintelligence, I knew there was a price. I knew I was committing to making the best possible film within certain available funds. Since I was self-financing, I was only limited by my available funds. I could have been even more scrupulous in analyzing this before starting, but I had a pretty good idea of what it would take to simply get the movie made well. Any extra funds pumped into the project were gravy. They were enhancements. Each film represents its maker. There's no sense settling to make the film you want to make in a compromising manner. These stories aren't going anywhere. You can always return to them later. Make the best film you can as soon as possible, budget it carefully, and make it for the price it needs. Lesson 3. Money comes and goes. Monitor it. The old adage, follow the money. It works in law enforcement, and it works in independent filmmaking. Filmmaking in general, particularly as budgets climb, is a money pit. I've been amazed at the level of frivolity with which productions throw money at problems instead of forethought, attention, and strategy. On Counterintelligence, I resolved to monitor the money passing through the project meticulously. Surprise costs popped up, but they were never surprising for too long. I'd add them to the budget sheet and maintain a real-time look at how much was spent and how much was left to spend. If you let it, money can fly out the door, but it doesn't spend itself, especially when funds are tight. Tracking every dollar is crucial. On a budget as small as Counterintelligence's, a few $100s amounted to a few percent of the budget. Even in the darkest moments where a large unforeseen cost had to be pushed through, tracking all other costs in the equation allowed me to constantly calibrate and recalibrate accordingly. I'm glad I kept an eye on the money. Creative surprises are gifts. Financial surprises are curses. Lesson 4. Cast with every iota of available attention. Of the full days spent on this film, the 2 initial days of casting were among the most exhausting. Every single person who comes through that door is deserving of your maximum focus and attention for their entire audition. In the beginning, each person must be treated as though they will be in your film. They may inhabit your character and work with you closely. They may surprise you with a new and interesting take on the part. They may have nerves that don't indicate the level of performance you're about to see. As the audition moves along, you may or may not know pretty quickly whether or not they fit the part. In some cases, you may know before they even say a line, but this is rare. Most often, you'll have to observe closely, looking at more than appearances or line readings. Look for an essence, something they exude without words or even without thinking. Sometimes you'll want to give them a second try. Maybe you intuit their nerves were getting in the way. Maybe you're on the fence and need a second look. Maybe you want to see them perform it in a completely different way. And when they leave, you want to send them off feeling respected and rewarded for their vulnerability. In callbacks, you want no doubts. If there are any, go back to the drawing board. As often as possible, casting shouldn't be rushed. There are so many plates to balance when selecting who represents the face of your film. Invest everything you have in this and never settle for less. If you do, you'll regret it. The wrong actor can burn through time as you try moving them in the opposite direction on set. They can feel trapped by the role, and the audience will disconnect from a film that's cast wrong. I'm sure you've experienced this as a viewer. I know I have. What's best for everyone? Put in the time and attention up front. Lesson 5. Work and friendship can coexist, though often at different times. In my professional life as a contractor or employee, I tend towards the philosophy, I'm not here to make friends, I'm here to work. On Counterintelligence, I worked with both people I knew long before and those I'd just met for the film. I invested time in surrounding myself with people I liked and respected. We were going to be on the front lines with one another, cooperating under stresses of time and money constraints. So my outlook kind of changed without my knowing it at the moment. At a rap party, watching everyone laugh and chat, hanging out into the late hours of the night and joining in with them, I'm not a total creep show, I was pleased to see we'd created friendships. The thing is, those friendships never took precedence over the work. Healthy collaboration and friendships begin at the same place, with mutual respect. If collaborators respect one another, they avert power struggles and unnecessary confrontation. These collaborations can blossom into friendships. I'm glad to have learned this. Now I know that it's possible to be friends and get work done. It just requires everyone involved know which comes first and when. Lesson 6, self-reflection is the antidote to intimidation. Knowing what you don't know. It doesn't close doors, it swings them wide open. Knowing what I didn't know allowed me to assess who and what I needed to get the job of making Counterintelligence not only done, but done well. Beginning a film is like staring down an infinite abyss of potential obstacles. Some you can predict, others you can't. There will always arise unpredictable hurdles. The job of starting strong is to reduce them. This is achieved by confronting as many predictable problems as early and often as possible. It costs nearly nothing to make these assessments early, but can add up fast on the fly later. Remember the hard drive problem? I ended up spending nearly $1,000, 8% of the overall budget, on external hard drives because I'd failed to do adequate math on storage or plan accordingly. It also cost me days of shifting files around between drives. This was one of a few potent experiences that reinforced a need to know what I don't know and seek answers to fill that void. Too many people assume that not knowing something now means they won't ever. There are many things you'd be better off outsourcing to another party, but you can't distinguish between those tasks and others you can learn without getting very honest with yourself. In the future, I'll try and be better at this. Each film reaffirms its importance. Lesson 7. Knowing when to listen is more important than speaking. Location sound mixer Tim Kahn talked in our interview about the importance of communication, a recurring topic throughout this season.
Communication is super, super important. I think the people that I've worked with a number of times have some innate respect for sound, or at least the work that I do, because they keep hiring me, which is great. But yeah, I mean, they know what I'm like on a set, and they know that I'm there to be respectful of everybody, but also to kind of stand my ground when I need to, but also know when it's not necessary.
In my view, communication is often misunderstood to mean speaking one's own point. In reality, communication is a dance. Speaking and listening are of equal importance, and therefore those on set must be able to do both. But much of this balance between the two comes from knowing when one is more important than the other, and this is harder to achieve with listening. In some cases, you could be dealing with a potential safety situation. Take this instance Dre talked about.
We drove out to Damascus, and then you had Sheree driving. She's like, I don't like driving, and then I talked to you guys. I was like, I don't think Sheree feels comfortable driving. You need to talk to her. And then you talked to her, and then she was like, okay, and then she drove. So that was like one of those things where communication is key on set, because you don't want your actors feeling uncomfortable or feeling like they have to do something when they don't. The crew, your producer, the director, whomever, needs to know how you feel and if you're comfortable doing something, if you're not. If you don't tell us, then how are we ever supposed to know? So I'm glad that we flushed that out.
Had Dre not taken the time to hear Sheree out and validate her concerns, I would never have had the chance to do the same. And had Sheree not felt that her concerns would be heard, she would have ended up in a potentially dangerous situation. Setting the standard of a listening set creates an open environment for everything from safety to creativity. And don't worry about that listening being abused. You can steer the ship. It's always better to develop openness than an authoritarian environment. Lesson 8. There's almost always another way to shoot. It's easy to be rigid. It can be seen as safer or more efficient. While this is often true, sometimes the plan simply isn't working. When we were shooting an office sequence on day 5, I'd storyboarded close-ups of both characters, mediums, and a 2-shot. In service of the performers, we did tighter shots first to hone in on the performance where they could be best seen. But by the time the 2-shot arrived, we'd failed to notice the symmetry of the room, neglecting that our wide would have to flip the axis. Now, if you're not sure what this means, it doesn't really matter. You'll confront situations like this, though, where your best laid plans get thwarted and you must make quick decisions. So Mike and I strategized how we could flip the axis and have it serve the story. We workshopped it through, deviating from the boards and even enhancing the effect of the scene. Also, when we lost hours on the night shoot to the generator sound and had to fly through the meat of the action sequence, Mike and I had to run and gun, scrutinizing the grammar of the scene as a whole and inventing shots as we went along. We went handheld almost entirely, and instead of replicating the storyboards, we looked them over and worked out where we could combine multiple shots into one using rapid movement. Though I was initially concerned, I now think the scene benefited from this technique, which we ended up using again on a later day. Necessity breeds creativity. Don't rigidly adhere to your plans if you can afford to mix them up. There's a time to follow the map and a time to chart new courses. Lesson 9, the director is in service of the film. From budgeting up through the latest stages of post-production, the director's every decision must be divorced from ego. Once a story is chosen to be told, every decision about the telling must come down to what's best for the story. If you're doing it right, Mike Hall reminds us that even the look of a film matters less.
A really good example that comes to mind is the documentary Dear Zachary, which is an incredibly intense documentary that I recently watched, and I was so engaged with it. But if you look at the overall quality of the production, wasn't amazing. The camera that they used, I don't know what they used. It was filmed like back in the early 2000s, but it was kind of grainy. Like the coloring wasn't great, but the story was so engaging. The editing was so well done that I didn't care about any of that stuff. Yes, obviously you should have really great sound. You should light it to the best of your ability, but I think that you need to look at it. I always talk about the 80-20 principle. So where are you going to get 80% of the results from 20% of the effort? And you want to focus on the 20%. Focus on your strengths. Focus on where you can really triple down. And then 80% of your success is going to come from 20% of that effort that you put in.
Every narrative speaks its own language, and the director is tasked with understanding, mastering, translating, and refining it. The director is a conduit between the narrative and the audience. All decisions must be filtered through this, even the decisions that a director stands by in the face of opposition. When weighing notes on certain scenes, whether they were pacing suggestions, clarity concerns, or character notes, if I decided to adhere to my initial decisions, I had to do so through the prism of imagining myself as the audience first. Lesson 10, just because you love the job, don't mean it loves you. Much was made in the episode on finishing this movie of my time floundering on color grading. Just because you love something doesn't mean it's most efficiently done by you. The same argument could be posed in favor of getting more administrative help early on, delegating more throughout, and seeking even wider reviews of Counterintelligence's various cuts. I've heard filmmakers of all stripes and levels in the game degrade certain parts of the process in favor of others. Some hate production and love post. Some love production more than writing. Personally, I love the entire filmmaking trajectory. Each piece of the puzzle is a fraction of the picture, and I actually get dismayed as the process draws nearer to ending. However, this doesn't mean I should take on every task I enjoy or know marginally well. Part of effective leadership is the ability to delegate. Money doesn't always permit delegation at the optimal level, but I never truly broached the full threshold of what I could delegate, often opting to take on more myself for fear that certain things would never get done or get done well. This is an enormous mistake, and not an uncommon one among artists. It ties back into my earlier sentiments about collaboration and Dre's remarks on sharing my vision. Part of the sharing has to do with divorcing from aspects of any process you love in favor of taking the higher level view of the process. As a director-producer, that's my job. Lesson 11. Audiences are not equivalent to dollars. Think of the times a film you've hotly anticipated comes out in theaters. Suddenly, the amount you want to see it is tested by when it'll be available to rent on demand from the comfort of your couch. And then that's further tested by when you anticipate it'll be streamable on Netflix or Amazon Prime at no extra cost to you. As I've researched extensively for the Counterintelligence release, I've come to see that audiences aren't simply interested buyers. They have viewing habits. Some audiences stream, some rent. Some, like myself, still buy hard media like Blu-rays or collect used DVDs. Audiences are far more nuanced than one-to-one ratios. If this group of people likes this type of thing, which is like your type of thing, they'll pay for it on these platforms. It's not necessarily the case. Part of taking a film to market is not just understanding who your audience is, what they care about, and why. It's also about understanding how they do what they do and where. All this information is discoverable, but keep that cornerstone in mind as you hunt for answers. Tools like Facebook Audience Insights and Amazon reviews can get you closer to specifics, but you also have to factor in plans for all possible outlets. Where can you make the biggest splash and generate the most revenue on each type of platform? Then how? And finally, Lesson 12. Fear never doing more than you fear failure. Every filmmaker I know who's been persistent and unwavering in their motivation is far more pained by not creating than they are by failure to connect with those who view their work. I've made 2 feature films. One, an abject failure. The other, a creative success and economic failure. What I've learned through both experiences, there's more to lighting a fire than either of those. Artistic expression is deeper and wider than any incentive system in existence. It's fed by its own fulfillment system, the act of expressing through art. Though I felt the heartbreak deeply in both previous cases, the fact that I remain here working and now sharing all of it with a bunch of strangers at even greater risk of emotional turmoil is evidence of the undying intention to create until my dying day. The most painful moments in my life as a creative person have always rooted back to not making a film. Stagnation isn't worthwhile to me anymore, and Counterintelligence was born of that. A year before I began Counterintelligence, I dealt with a series of crippling panic attacks. This instability and turmoil sustained for months, beginning in the fall and slowing to a crawl in midwinter. Life was dogpiling on me as I felt trapped, stagnant, and thought I needed to turn the metaphorical lens back on the goals that seemed to have gone unacknowledged for some time. For all the financial and career stability I'd achieved, something was missing. That's when the writing commitment began, when I rediscovered fearlessness and redefined methodology. From there, I created these options for myself in the form of scripts, committed to one, and set about on the adventure that became making Counterintelligence, and later, this podcast. Both Counterintelligence and Make This Movie were born of fear. Not a fear of failure or not measuring up, but a fear of not expressing. A fear of the stories locked in my brain, rotting there in isolation. A great story I frequently remind myself of is how the beautiful film The Fall, elegantly directed by Tarsem Singh, got made. Tarsem had gone through a series of minor heartbreaks. He'd made a cult classic film, The Cell, many years before to little avail. He'd become a successful commercial and music video director, and to my recollection was in a depressed state over a personal heartbreak. Then, he was visited by his brother. The two had hatched this concept many years before for a film that never got off the ground. It was a gothic fairy tale, set against an international backdrop, imagined through collections of exotic, little-known real-world locations that could stand in for the world of a child's imagination. Because it had never gotten the green light, making it became a fairy tale of its own for them, until that day when Tarsem was visited by his concerned brother, who presented him with a definitive challenge. He said, "Do you want to be two old men sitting on a porch talking about the movie we never made, or do you want to make it?" For the next 4 years, Tarsem bankrolled this globe-trotting masterpiece out of his own pocket, constructing a singularly gorgeous vision that, while not hugely commercially successful, garnered the admiration of other filmmakers like Spike Jonze and David Fincher and became a deep influence to me and many of my friends. It was an art house masterpiece that continues finding its audience as the years pass. After my own stint of mental disarray, I had the same decision to make. Do I want to keep waiting for something in my life to change, or is there something I can do to change it? Then came the writing, then came the revisions, the talks with Dre and Mike Elliott, the bean counting in my bank account, and now, years later, we did it. And whether it's loved or lost, we made this movie. I hope for the sake of everyone involved that their hard work is at the very least seen by as many people as possible. So, months after we'd wrapped shooting, and I sat and listened to the audio diary in its entirety, going through all the agony all over again, while looking back on the victory I knew it had become, a smile just crept across my face. It got wider and wider as I droned on and on, because I knew I had it there. I had the perfect Spielberg ending for Make This Movie, Season 1. And I hadn't even known it. A Spielberg ending in this case would remind the listener why we subject ourselves to making films when we know the obstacles at every stage. Why the fuck do we do this in the first place? I don't have to say it now, here, because I already said it before. I hope it reminds you to jump without fear, because there's a lot to love in this madhouse circus that is filmmaking. There's a lot to gain from the pain, friends to be made, ideas to be studied, and risks to take. There's a lot of it all. So, while Counterintelligence has a Scorsese ending, I hope you enjoy Make This Movie's Spielberg ending. After the closing music, I want you to jump, get started, write a page, call a collaborator, or just do the thing you've been procrastinating that's standing between you now and you with a film in the can. Because if you do this one, you'll do others. Go make great work. And here's why.
These are the types of compromises and the things that you have to be okay with when you make a film. And all that considered, I think we're doing an exceptional job. And I think that we're exceeding our own expectations in a lot of ways. And it's really affirming to me that every time I get scared or freaked out or think that, maybe this is too ambitious, maybe it's not going to work. Well, we're almost halfway through, and with very few exceptions, it keeps working. Relatively few exceptions in the grand scheme of things, it keeps working. So, all in all, I think we're at a really good place. And now I'm hungry. And I'm tired. Soccer out.
Thank you so much for listening to Season 1 of Make This Movie. Counterintelligence will be released in the fall of 2018. If you want to keep up with it, visit counterflick.com and sign up for updates. And or go to showhawk.com and sign up there. I'd like to thank everyone involved in making Counterintelligence and everyone willing to be included in this podcast, as well as those who couldn't make it on. Both projects have been massive endeavors, and I'm grateful for all the help, counsel, and cooperation I received along the way. If you're a filmmaker and want the extra tools and guides for making your own movie, check out showhawk.com/makethismovie and sign up. Every episode of this show is accompanied by a long-form toolkit plotting out the lessons, tools, documents, software, and tutorials to translate this season into a how-to for you and your team. It's everything you need to turn your vision into a micro-budget feature. The guide is free, just sign up, and no spamming, we promise. I've really put a great deal of time and work into these toolkits and have been getting a great response from them, so check them out. showhawk.com/makethismovie. If you enjoyed Make This Movie, please share it with everyone you know who's interested in filmmaking, and don't forget to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen, rate the show, and leave a comment. They help us rank and help other people who like the same stuff as you find us. And again, thank you so much for following this journey with me and Showhawk. We're proud to have shared it with you and hope you'll come back next season where we'll explore the next movie we're making. Until then, in the coming weeks we'll be releasing some extended interviews. While we aren't releasing all the great interviews we did for this season because they vary in length and format, we'll be putting out some that we felt were like little masterclasses in some aspect of the filmmaking process. So stay tuned for those. They're going to be amazing. And one last time, thank you again. We'll see you next year.